So first, talk a little bit about, come back to AltaLink. Why this story and what are we talking about today? So the topic that I have is identifying decision makers. Who, why, when, and how. So how did this come about? I'm part of the planning committee for this event, and as we were sort of brainstorming topics, one of the things that we recognized was that my career has actually been made up of a series of different roles where I've been responsible for some sort of transformation. So we started talking about that and said, maybe there's something in there. And, you know, what is it that leads you to those kinds of roles, and why is it that you do that kind of work? And one of the things that we sort of landed on is it's about influence and influencing decision makers, and why is that important? And it's really interesting because I haven't been able to be at all of the sessions, but even the ones that I have been at, there's some recurrent themes, and we didn't get together and review our slides beforehand, but it's going to be interesting because you're going to hear some of the same words in mine that you've heard in some of the previous presentations. So my background, as Kate mentioned in the introduction, is, she said over 20 years. I'm coming up to 25 years, I guess, in supply chain. I worked for about 10 years in healthcare. From there I went to Canadian Pacific Railway, from there to TransAlta. From there, a very short stint with Jacobs Engineering, and from there to the University of Calgary, where I led their supply chain group, and now most recently at AltaLink. So I'll tell you a little bit about sort of those roles and sort of what that theme was of transition and transformation through each of them, and tell you a little bit about AltaLink as well. And then we'll get into, you know, some guiding principles, I guess, that I've sort of grasped onto over my career, and things that I think might be useful for you to take away today. The healthcare days, the first 10 years of my career in Alberta, were when I started as the purchasing manager at the hospital in Banff. And that was when every hospital in the province of Alberta was independently operated, had its own board. And in the mid-1990s, for anyone that's been in Alberta for that long, we went through a process where most of our hospitals were amalgamated into health regions. So I became the director of purchasing for the health region. So there's a transformation. Group of hospitals that had never worked together before. We needed to consolidate some warehouses, figure out how we were going to, you know, maximize and be more efficient. That was sort of my first, 10 years in that type of a role. From there, I went to Canadian Pacific Railway in the late 1990s, just when they had, shortly after they'd moved their head office from Montreal to Calgary. So the organization was going through a major transformation right at that point in time. And they launched a strategic sourcing group based out of Calgary. So I was hired as part of that team. A few years later, I went to TransAlta when TransAlta was doing the same thing. 2001, they launched a corporate strategic sourcing group. So I moved to TransAlta and joined them. I left TransAlta in 2007 and went to Jacobs Engineering as a project procurement manager on a major oil sands project. And interestingly enough, just discovered that that wasn't where I wanted to live, and within a few months started looking elsewhere again, and left and went to the University of Calgary. And I was there for 3.5 years leading their supply chain group. And again, it was another transformation exercise. They were doing an administrative review and transformation in a lot of their administrative support services, HR, IT, supply chain, finance. And I played a lead role in that process while it was happening. And now here I am at AltaLink. So let me tell you a little bit more about AltaLink. So Alberta's largest regulated utility electric transmission company. So what's that mean? As Bobby Lambright said yesterday from ATCO Electric, we don't really even think about electricity unless you hit the light switch and nothing happens. AltaLink is part of that industry in Alberta. And for those of you that don't really know anything about electricity, I like to describe it quite simply this way. Electricity gets produced at power plants like hydro plants or coal-fired power plants, and that's called generation. It then gets dispersed throughout a geographic area on power lines that are high voltage, big lines. That's called transmission. Once it actually gets to businesses and homes, it gets downgraded to lower voltage to come into houses and businesses, and that's called distribution. So there's various companies in Alberta that play in that industry, but AltaLink is part of the middle link of that process in transmission. They're a relatively young company. They've only been around for 11 years, and they were actually a spin-off from TransAlta. So I work with a lot of people at AltaLink that have had some history at TransAlta where I've been before. They started with about 120 people 10 years ago, and we're up to about 800 people now. Over the course of that 10 years, the amount of capital projects, and Bobby also was alluding to that with ATCO yesterday. The capital infrastructure activity within the utility industry in Alberta is very significant, and even more significant in the next 2 or 3 years coming up. So there's a lot happening in the utility industry in this province, and part and parcel with all of that led to my role and what I'm doing now at AltaLink. So our executives made a decision a couple of years ago that they needed to think forward and be planning to prepare for their future and where AltaLink was going to go. Even though we're wholly centered within Alberta, we also have an independent arm of our company that is looking at opportunities elsewhere in Canada, the United States, and South America. So growth is in the future. It's a very successful company, and there's a lot happening there. So they made a decision to invest in some resources and some funding to transform their procurement team. So I started with AltaLink last March, and small team. We had about 8 people, and as of hopefully 2 weeks from now, when I fill my final position that I've been working on all year, we'll have 20 people. So I've more than doubled the size of the team that I've had in the last 11 months since I've been there. So we've heard some conversations about recruitment. That's been a big part of my life in the last little while. But really it's just, again, how do we transform what the procurement group, and it's more than procurement. We're calling it procurement, but really I guess in my mind, it's a supply chain team. I'm accountable for procurement activities, contracting, warehousing, our fleet of vehicles, that realm of activity. So how do we transform that and help our team catch up with where AltaLink has grown to and prepare for AltaLink's future? So back to the concept of identifying decision makers, who, why, when, and how. So a bit of a Dilbert cartoon here for you that I'll read if you can't see it from back there. So the first one is a salesperson coming in saying, clever salesman evaluates his prey. Next one, in a bubble in his thought, he says, I hope he's an important decision maker. Dilbert says, take a seat, I call the good chair. He goes, oh, warning, cubicle, low-ranking employee. Next one says, here's our org chart. President, senior vice president, vice president. Dilbert's drawing that out on the flip chart. And then Dilbert says to him, okay, lift your foot. Do you see that coffee stain on the carpet? The salesperson says, that's you? Dilbert says, no, that's my boss. I'd be under the carpet. So the salesperson says, do I have any hope of talking to somebody who can make a decision? Dilbert says, let me see. Leans over his cubicle wall and says, hey, Wally, what's a decision? Wally says, sounds like something our competitors do. So that's fairly focused on, you know, just who are the decision makers, and I'm not going to spend actually a lot of time on that. I want to talk a lot more today probably on the how do you influence decision makers. So a couple of books and articles that I have come across, one that I've used quite a lot and one that I just have come in contact with recently. This is from a book called Influencer, The Power to Change Anything, and I've actually just read it recently, even though it's about 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old. And I just wanted to start with a simple quote. An influencer motivates and enables others to change. So as I started thinking and articulating this whole concept of, you know, what is a decision maker, how do you influence them, that really was simple and stood out true for me. Part of my job every day when I go to work is to try and enable others to change and to influence them. So based on that, though, I found an article a few years ago, and I actually was really surprised when I read it because it really resonated with me as something that I've actually been doing most of my career and hopefully getting better at as time has gone by. And it's an article that was written by a fellow named Marshall Goldsmith, and it was an online Business Week article a few years ago. And he lists 11 guidelines for effectively influencing decision makers. And I just want to go through those with you. Every decision that affects our lives will be made by the person who has the power to make that decision. Not the right person, or the smartest person, or the best person. Make peace with this fact. So I think we need to learn that not only are we not always the ones that get to make the decision, we may not even think that the right person is making the decision. But in some senses and in some situations, it's a fact of life. You'd think we'd figure that out when we're young and, you know, get a poor grade on a report card and don't think it's fair or justified. We're not the decision maker, you know. But sometimes it takes people years and maybe never before they actually figure that out. It doesn't mean that I think we should, roll over and let other people decide our fate, because I think persistence is actually one of the most significant components of actually influencing decision makers. But I think that there's a certain truth to this, in that you have to just figure this out so that you can actually then get on with influencing the decision makers and having a positive influence on what you're doing. And I think it'll just make you happier too. Bit of a side story, I guess, is that, as I read through that and looked back on my career, sometimes I've liked my leaders, sometimes I haven't. Sometimes they've been people that I've been able to, form good alliances with, sometimes not. But over the years, I guess, in the beginning, that was critical factor number one for me. If I didn't like the person that I was working for, or the executive leadership in the organization I was in, that would be a non-starter for me. Today, I think I've, grown to the point where it's a factor, but it's certainly not the thing that drives my decisions and how I face my day every day. There are some good people out there. I've worked for men, I've worked for women, I've worked for engineers, I've worked for accountants, I've worked for people in all different industries and trades, and if anything, I think I look back on things I've learned from them, good things and bad things. So there's certainly some things that I look back on and think, as a leader, I will never do what that leader did, and to me that's a learning. And I have to tell you one little story about that. One of my first jobs after university, and I don't even really count it as part of my real career, because I only did it for about 4 months. But I worked at a small company, and which will remain unnamed, and I won't even tell you the industry, so you won't figure it out. But the woman that owned the company would go through our garbage cans at night. And I knew that because I'm very meticulous and organized, and every once in a while I'd come in the morning and there would be things back on my desk that I knew I had put in the garbage the day before. So I learned that early on, that it was like, I don't know if she thought we were being wasteful and throwing out paper that we should be using for scrap paper or something. But the funniest part of that whole story was probably 15 years later, I was talking with a coworker on that exact subject. Who's the best boss you ever had? Who's the worst boss you ever had? And the coworker started to describe a woman that she'd worked for. And she said, you know what, at night she'd go through our garbage cans. And I said, no way. And I said, was her name X? We had both worked for the same woman and didn't know it. So it was kind of funny. And so, of course, they were a bit more creative than I was at the time. They actually started making up fake appointments in their diaries and things so that she would read them when they weren't there. So that's something that, this one resonated with me. It doesn't necessarily need to be the best person, the smartest person, the right person. Sometimes decision makers, who they are who they are, and you need to make peace with that and figure out how to maneuver your way through the work world. Second, when presenting ideas to decision makers, realize that it's your responsibility to sell, not their responsibility to buy. So this sounds like a typical sort of sales thing, but I am a buyer. That's what I do and what we do in our field. But I still every day need to be able to sell my ideas. I need to be able to influence people. I need to get them to understand what it is that I'm trying to get across. And if that doesn't happen, it's not necessarily their fault. I need to take responsibility for that. I need to learn how to present my ideas clearly. I need to be able to communicate clearly. And I need to be able to educate those decision makers to be able to help them make the right decision. Know your material, learn to communicate, listen as much, if not more, than talk. Another example, I guess, that I've thought of in relation to this one is I've had an experience with a very smart young woman that's worked for me who really needs to learn how to communicate, to learn her audience. And an example happened where I'd been away for a couple of weeks and my inbox was filling up, and every time I looked at my BlackBerry there was more messages, and on sort of the end of the 2 weeks, and I was away for work, I got a message from her that I just couldn't even comprehend. It was too long. So, not only did she fail to catch my attention, she didn't even get me to read the message. Like, it had completely failed her ability to try and communicate what she was trying to tell me, which there was probably some nugget in there that was really important. But part of that coaching and learning for her then is learn your audience, figure out how to communicate with them, know what's right, and make the medium appropriate so that you actually get through to them, because if you're not, or if you don't, you risk not even being heard. Focus on contribution to the larger good, not just the achievement of your own objectives. You'll always be more successful when you can explain why something benefits your larger organization rather than just you or your team. This one I think is fairly self-explanatory. In moving any business decision forward, there has to be a broader benefit to your organization. And don't assume that the decision maker can automatically connect the dots between what you're telling them and what that broader benefit is. You need to spell it out for them. Strive to win the big battles. I really like this one. It's what? 6 little words, but for me, this one's almost a life principle. Anybody that knows me, and there's somebody in the room that's worked with me before, anybody knows me knows that, you know, I can be really persuasive, I can win an argument, ask my husband, probably knows it all too well, but that's not always what you need to do. So in the beginning of my career, I think I was trying to, make a name for myself, being assertive, being aggressive, but I think you really need to sit back and pick your battles, figure out which hills you're going to die on, and strive to win the big ones. Don't waste time on issues that are only going to have a minimal impact on results. So if it's not something that your organization's going to get great benefit from, don't waste your time, don't waste the organization's time. Focus on the big nuggets. Present a realistic cost-benefit analysis of your ideas. Don't just sell benefits. So every time you move a decision forward for approval, recognize that, like any organization, resources have to be spread out across multiple different initiatives. So sometimes for your idea or initiative to be approved or accepted means that somebody else's is not going to get approved or accepted. So think about that. Make sure that your decision makers have the full picture, know the truth. They don't want to see it through rose-colored glasses. They actually want to know the full story. You don't always need to pad the truth. Again, in my background over 20-some years, I had a particular colleague or coworker who had a real habit of doing that. And not only did that not help his initiatives and his projects move forward, but it didn't help his relationships with his colleagues or coworkers either. If we knew that whatever was going forward was always not quite the truth, we became skeptics of it as well. So don't do that to yourself. Make sure that you've got all of the facts out there and that it's a realistic cost-benefit analysis. Challenge up on issues involving ethics or integrity. Never remain silent on ethics violations. Hopefully you'll never be in a situation where you're actually asked to do anything by your employer that's a violation of corporate ethics. If you are, immediately notify the appropriate person about your concerns. A couple of things to keep in mind though. Don't assume that management has intentionally requested you to do something wrong. In some cases, it might be the result of misunderstandings or poor communication. So try to present your case in a manner that's intended to be helpful and not judgmental. At the end of the day, we sleep better if we do the right thing. I'd have to say, fortunately, I haven't had too many experiences like this, but I did have one experience where, as the result of my involvement in a strategic sourcing exercise, I became aware of some government reporting that had possibly been done not quite accurately. And it could have been a fairly significant and serious issue. So I escalated it appropriately. And the outcome of doing that has been something that I've reflected on many times in my career. Someone lost their job over it. And it wasn't the person that actually submitted the false report. It was the person that had been perceived somewhat as the technical whistleblower that made me aware of what the issue was. So a few lessons on that. I had a really good relationship with that person and kept in touch with them after they were let go. They ended up in a better place. They were 10 times happier knowing that that was the environment that they were in. It all turned out well for them, but I cried the day that happened. Me escalating something caused somebody else to lose their job. And it's still, that was several years ago, and it still resonates with me today. But at the end of the day, I know I did the right thing, and it turned out the way it should have turned out. In the end, it was corrected and reported appropriately and correctly back to the authorities that it needed to know. There was some collateral damage there. I guess the one learning I had from that was don't put yourself in a situation where you might take the fall for somebody else. So it could have been me that lost the job just because I'd raised the situation. I still think I did the right thing, but it was a rough couple of weeks when that happened. So I hope you don't ever have to go through that, but if you do, do the right thing. Realize that powerful people are just as human as you are. So try to refrain from saying things like, I'm amazed that someone at that level doesn't understand this, or I can't believe that somebody in that position would make that kind of a decision. Even though we may think those things sometimes, you have to look at things from their perspective. Someday I may be in one of those individuals' roles or positions. Someday people that report to me may be in my role or position. We have different filters that we bring to it. We need to look at things from those perspectives. Look at it from all angles and have some understanding. Treat decision makers with the same courtesy that you would treat customers. Don't be disrespectful. This is kind of the golden rule principle, treat others the way you would like to be treated. And I think also heard it this morning, well, it's important to avoid kissing up to decision makers. It's equally as important to avoid the opposite reaction. Never trash your company or make destructive comments about your leaders or coworkers. Before you speak, 4 questions that you might want to consider. Does this comment help our company? Does it help our customers? We all have customers somewhere, even though in our roles in supply chain, we often aren't close to the front line. We have customers that help with the success of our organizations. Will this comment help the person I'm talking to, or will it help the person I'm talking about? And if you answer no to all of those questions, don't say it. As we discussed earlier, it's always important to challenge up on integrity issues, but it's not appropriate to stab decision makers in the back. Support the final decision of the organization. So as someone that's been in a leadership role for many, many years, believe me, I've had to deliver messages that maybe I didn't 100% support. We all have to do it. But the worst thing you can do is say, I don't agree with this, but here's what we're going to do. Assuming that a decision's not immoral, illegal, unethical, go out and try to make it work. Managers who always say, well, this is what they told me to tell you, they're going to be seen as messengers, not leaders. And demonstrating your lack of commitment to a decision can sabotage the chances of success for that initiative. And the other thing too is that, if your employees and direct reports see you stabbing someone in the back, how do you think they're going to react when they have a disagreement with you? So be loyal, and if you can't be loyal, maybe you need to be thinking about where else you want to work. Make a positive difference. Don't just try to win or be right. So focus on how you can make things better, not on how somebody else is screwing things up. The more other people can be right or win with your idea, the more likely it is to get support. So try to find the positive in it for many people, not just yourselves. And the last principle they have is focus on the future, let go of the past. So the quote that Kara made yesterday from Hunter Harrison, as soon as she said that, it was like, that just resonated with me and focused on this one too. So I actually Googled it last night, and those of you that may not have heard Kara yesterday, I was hoping she would be here because I would tell her the quote actually came from J. Paul Getty, so Hunter Harrison stole it from him. But the quote actually was, in times of rapid change, experience could be your worst enemy. So J. Paul Getty actually had a little bit softer version than Hunter Harrison did. The other thing I thought was funny too is when I looked at that last night, I also found that J. Paul Getty, for those of you that don't know, was one of the wealthiest men in America during the time that he lived, which was 1892 to 1976. And over the course of his life, he had 5 wives and 5 children. And so I thought this other quote from him was kind of interesting too. A lasting relationship with a woman is only possible if you're a business failure. I'll repeat it. A lasting relationship with a woman is only, make sure I get it right, is only possible if you're a business failure. So, therefore, that's why he had 5 wives, but lots of money, I guess. Anyway, back to the concept of experience being your worst enemy. So my interpretation of this, again, is not that expertise is not valuable, but rather that when you pine for what used to be, you're never going to be able to focus on what could be and where you can get to positively. Successful people love getting ideas aimed at helping them achieve their goals. So focus on the future will increasing your odds of effectively influencing decision makers. And it'll also help you build better long-term relationships with people at work. So that's the 11 guidelines. And like I said, I read that probably 5 years ago. And it was interesting because some of them were like, wow, that's something I actually kind of always thought. I just hadn't put it into a document like that. So again, if you're interested, it was Marshall Goldsmith, and it was a Business Week website. Further to the 11 guidelines, in preparing for this presentation, I actually talked to what I believe to be a few influential women within my own organization. So 3 senior vice presidents at AltaLink are women, and I sat down with each of them and had a conversation about influencing decision makers to get their perspective. And I wanted to share just a few points from each of them. So seed the idea early. So be there first. If you've got an idea, you want to actually move forward with something, get there first, seed it early. Decisions aren't always logical. The example that was given to me with that one was a woman who had, one of the senior VPs that I talked to at a prior role in her life had spent many months actually working on a proposal to develop and locate a new office and what would be where it would be located and what the service providings out of that office would be. And in the end, the location for the office was chosen based on where a particular senior executive was going to be retiring. So had absolutely nothing to do with all the logic that she'd put together in her business case. So just know that that can happen. Don't corner anyone. I thought that was an interesting one. Don't ever leave a decision maker in a place where they have no option, because they won't feel good about it and it won't reflect well on you either. You don't always need to be the closer. Recognize when you need an alternate or an enabler. So that one again was really interesting. You know, 3 very career seasoned women, and one of them told me about more than one experience where she's recognized that she's not the right person to close this deal. And she's not in sales, it's not, but it's, you know, it's a significant decision, significant initiative, needing to work with other key stakeholders. But she said that, you know, she gave me a couple of examples where she just realized that she didn't have the rapport, something wasn't clicking, she was never going to get there if it was her. She recognized it early on and found an enabler or someone else that could actually do that in order to ensure that the initiative went forward. Don't be overly invested in your own opinion. So that's another interesting one for me. Again, from my early days in my career, back to what I was saying before, you want to be the one that's, you know, assertive and out there and pushing it, and you're always right, and you know why you're right, and it's logical, and really, really, you know, sometimes too aggressive. Sit back sometimes, recognize there's lots of other smart people in the room, and you need to be able to pick the right idea, not necessarily just your own. Recognize your own biases. Don't need to explain that too much. I mean, we all have our own filters, whether it's on the kind of people that we like to work with, where we want to work, the kind of work that we want to do. Recognize that, because it's going to influence how you actually move through the work world. Listening is as important as speaking, said that one before. And sometimes you might not get to your agenda until you deal with theirs. So this one was from one of the senior VPs that's actually done some fairly significant provincial political work. And it was interesting because she told me a very long story about having one detractor that was going to have the ability to completely derail what she was trying to move forward with. And she said, I couldn't get anywhere until I figured out what was going on with him, what was going on with his agenda, and figure out how to solve that. And once they did that and she gained his trust, rapport, credibility, the rest of it was smooth. Okay, so that's my thoughts about, how to influence the official decision maker. Now, how do you influence the rest? So every job I've ever had, usually by the time I've arrived, they've made a decision to launch this initiative, and I've been hired as part of that process. So it carries on then in what I do every day when I go to work. How do I influence the people around me? How do I influence my team, my colleagues, my executives? How do I move this initiative forward? And I'm not going to spend a lot more time on this next model, but I did want to also then point out something about the book that I read recently, the one that I referred to called Influencer, The Power to Change Anything. So Carrie Patterson, Joseph Grenier are the two primary authors. And in their book, they've identified 6 sources of influence. So they believe that before you can influence change, you have to decide what you're trying to change. So the research also shows that if you identify a handful of high-value behaviors and change those behaviors, you can make the change. They think that you have to start first with 2 questions. Can I do what's required, and will it be worth it? And then they subdivide that into subcategories to get the 6 sources of influence. So I just want to read through those again. So the 2, motivation and ability. So again, can I do what's being asked of me, and will it be worth it? So under motivation, they're saying then personal motivation, make it the undesirable desirable. Personal ability, surpass your limits. Social motivation, harness peer pressure. Social ability, find strength in numbers. Structural motivation, design rewards and demand accountability. And structural ability, change the environment. So there's training courses and all kinds of things about these 6 sources of influence, and I'm not going to go into that. But what I did find corresponding to it that I thought was also really interesting was a little video. So I want you to watch this.
What you're about to see is real. Real kids doing real things. Just thought you should know. My name's Hiram Grenny, and I was there for the whole thing. So here's a question. What does it take to get people to change? And I'm not talking about their socks and underwear. Real kids, but change behavior, especially when it's hard. For example, every year, close to 100,000 people die from hospital-acquired infections. That means people got real sick. Kids at doing the hospital. Real things. And it turns out one of the main culprits is hand hygiene. And I was there for the whole thing. That means just getting people to wash their hands could save lives. So my crack research team decided to conduct an experiment. What does it take to get people to change? Difficult. And I'm not talking about their socks and underwear, with the toughest subjects but change behavior. Kids, especially. So here's what we did. For example, 80 munchkins. Every year, close to 100,000 people die from hospital-acquired infections. That means people got kind sick. Of like the projects you adults are always busy with. And it turns out then one of the main culprits is hand hygiene. That means just getting people to wash their hands could save lives. So my crack research team decided to conduct an experiment to see if we could change something. Once I see that you guys just put the whole puzzle together correctly, I'll raise my flag, just like this, and then I'll blow my whistle. Okay? And when I do that, you guys can all go and get your cupcake. So what would it take to get these kids to wash their hands? How about a good reason? So one thing you guys should know, there was a sick kid in here playing with the puzzle pieces. He had a runny nose and coughed a lot, so there's probably a lot of germs on everything. But there's hand sanitizer over there on the table that you can use to wash up. Okay, which will win out? Delicious frosted cupcakes or the fear of the typhoid toddler? Let's watch. They finished their task, and look, if the threat of one sick kid wasn't enough, just look at all the new germs popping up.
Waiting on the technology to catch up to us.
So with all those good reasons to wash, what do you think they'll do? Okay, so that was a colossal failure. Now what? Well, at this point, most adults would quit. That's why you just keep changing the year on those New Year's resolutions. With the next group of kids, I changed the environment by moving the hand sanitizer closer, and then put up a visual cue. This ought to make hand washing easier and more obvious, right? And in the end, the motivation to not get sick plus changing the environment didn't influence a single kid. Yikes! Next, I increased their ability, which is another source of influence. I had them all complete what is known as deliberate practice, or training, to increase their familiarity with good hand hygiene. Will adding another source of influence get these hand-washing offenders to wash up? Done. And... well, now we're seeing some better results. We're combining 3 different sources of influence, and some of the kids are actually washing their hands. It looks like we're on the right track. So next, I added another source of influence, social influence. What if somebody spoke up and said something? What would happen if their bosses were in the room with them? Here come the cupcakes. And there goes the flag. Will they wash? No! Look at them pouncing on those cupcakes like a pack of ravenous hyenas. But it's not too late, because something important happens. At just the critical moment, a peer, not even one of the bosses, speaks up.
Wash your hands.
Watch the effect. Success at last! So social motivation obviously made a difference. But was it the only thing that mattered? What about our other sources of influence? Here's what my kids had to say.
This sign. I was walking over to get my cupcake, but then someone said, wash your hands, because this boy had the sniffles in here.
So what's the point? We often underwhelm overwhelming problems. We try a couple of things, and when they don't work, we give up. But my dad and his colleagues discovered the secret to overcoming tough problems. You need to combine at least 4, preferably more, sources of influence. And it doesn't matter if you try it with kids or hospitals, at the office, or even at home. If you use 4 or more sources of influence, your chances for success go up 10 times. 10 times! So there it is. The key to changing almost anything is to marshal the power of at least 4 or more sources of influence, but preferably all 6. And heaven knows, we need it.
That's it. I thought that would be a fun note to finish it on. So just some thanks. That's the name of the 3 senior vice presidents that I actually talked to, Joanne Picard-Thompson, Lori Topp, and Linda Shea, and the book and the article that I referred to. And as I understand these, my presentation will be posted, so you'll see this on our website. Back to this. An influencer motivates and enables others to change. So hopefully I gave you a few tools to throw in your toolkit along with everything else that you've heard from all the other women that you have spoke over the last couple of days. Thank you.